Delmarva Today with Don Rush.
State and federal officials admit they will not meet the 2025 goals for cleaning up the Chesapeake Bay. You're listening to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. Bay Journal editor-at-large Karl Blankenship says the reason the region has struggled over the last 40 years to meet those goals is the difficulty in reducing nutrient pollution from agriculture. He is writing several major pieces on why the competing trends of increased and changing production on the one hand have clashed with the nutrient reduction efforts on the other. We drove up to his home in Pennsylvania to seek some answers.
First of all, one of the cornerstone issues for the Bay for the last half century has been an excess amount of nitrogen and phosphorus that flows off the watershed and into the Chesapeake Bay, where it creates algae blooms. And when that algae dies, it sinks to the bottom and it depletes the water of oxygen, creating dead zones. And then the algae blooms block sunlight from reaching underwater grass beds, which are really critical habitat. And so for the last half century, we've been trying to reduce nutrients. And agriculture has by far been the largest source of nutrients to the Chesapeake Bay. Wastewater treatment plants have been largely upgraded. They were major sources, but there were technological fixes for wastewater treatment plants, and their nutrient discharges have decreased substantially over time. And you have other sources, airborne deposition from power plants, from cars and things. They emit a lot of nitrogen oxides. That nitrogen is a form of nutrients posited on the land. And we've had really tightened regulations on emissions, and those have decreased dramatically over time. And you have runoff stormwater from developing lands, and those have increased as there's been more development. There's been more regulation to try to rein that in. But when you talk about nutrients, the largest source has always been agriculture, and it's proven to be really one that's difficult to control. It's not because farmers haven't done anything. We've got a lot of best management practices, things like cover crops and streamside buffers, better technology to apply nutrients on the landscape, and all that's helping. But at the same time, we have increased demand for agricultural products, and that drives more production. We have more livestock in the watershed. That's chickens, and other types of animals have generally increased quite a bit. And the demand for crops has increased. And so although croplands decreased a bit, the productivity per acre has actually been increasing. And as you increase your production, you typically have to apply a little bit more on the landscape. So even though you're becoming more efficient at producing, you have to apply more to get more. And so your net reductions, it can offset some of the effect of what you're doing on the landscape.
Describe for me the kind of innovations that you see when it comes to agriculture that has produced this ability to intensify the growth of crops, the ability to grow more on, say, even a lesser amount of land.
Since the mid-20th century, there's just been essentially a revolution in agriculture where chemical fertilizers became available really for the first time, and new hybrids, particularly of things like corn, revolutionized production, and the per acre yields began to really increase dramatically. For animals, there's been improved genetic works and stuff. You can grow more chickens. The chickens are bigger. Throughout agriculture, there's just been a variety of things that have happened which allow more production and more efficient production, really for the last 50, 60, 70 years. It's dramatic increases.
One of the things that struck me is that you see this relationship between agriculture, the crops growing on the one hand, connected to the expansion of the growth of animal production on the other.
Yeah, what's happened is if you were to go back a century, the agricultural landscape in this region was a lot different. It was more diversified. And in part, you'd be growing animals and you'd collect their manure and you'd apply it to the croplands. And it was kind of recycled and it kind of kept your nutrients in balance. But after World War II, those technologies changed quite a bit. You had chemical fertilizer that became cheap and easily applied to the fields. And it began to change that system. It became more economical to start growing more livestock in this region because it was close to a lot of urban areas. It reduced transportation costs. It started to promote a much more intense animal farming operations than were ever feasible before. At that time, we also began to intensify the grain production to feed the animals, but it became possible and economically realistic to supplement what we could grow here with grain imported from the Midwest, especially corn. And so those changes in production and economics really promoted a system in which you grow a lot more livestock here, and you therefore accumulate a lot of manure, more manure than is necessarily needed by the fields anymore, because that system got disconnected with the system of the availability of cheap fertilizer and changes in the transportation system. And so you ended up with this system which allowed way more nutrients to be concentrated in this region than really would have happened, say, a century ago. And that's why after mid-century you start to see evidence of more nutrient enrichment in the bay after like the 1950s going into the 60s and stuff like that.
It strikes me that you get that relationship with, say, for instance, certainly on the Eastern Shore, this production of poultry. You get more and more poultry farms as you grow, and obviously you have more grain that can then feed the chickens and so on. I mean, there seems to be the cycle here.
Yeah, there used to be much more diversified agriculture on the Eastern Shore. They used to grow lots of vegetables. You go back decades and things. Now all that comes from California because it's really cheap to produce there. And so you got this system where you grow lots of chickens and then you have a lot of grain fields to feed those chickens. And that's kind of the system that's evolved, and they're kind of mutually dependent. Like if you didn't have the chicken industry, what would you do with the grain? It's not as economically produced as in, say, Iowa. You might not have the demand for all that grain, which calls into question, what would happen to all that farmland.
Now, we have obviously, going particularly into the 1980s, we have this concern about the health of the bay. We begin to get laws enacted in order to create some kind of restoration of the bay. What kind of emphasis did they place in terms of what they were looking at? Because I understand it's more, they were looking at water quality, that kind of thing.
In the 1970s, because of concern about the deterioration of the water quality, there was legislation for EPA to do this multi-year study of Chesapeake Bay health. They released those results in the early 1980s, and one of the big things they pointed to was eutrophication caused by too many nutrients entering the system. And it was recognized from fairly early on that agriculture was a major source of those. What really wasn't recognized was the difficulty of controlling nutrients from agriculture, because that wasn't really anything that anybody was actively doing. It was kind of a new concern. The agencies that were working on the bay didn't have a lot of familiarity with agriculture, and so they were kind of just feeling their way along as to what you would do with this. And the idea kind of evolved into, if you just go and slather a lot of best management practices, cover crops, buffers, nutrient management, manure storage pits. If you get enough of those on the landscape, that hopefully you'd ultimately reduce your nutrient runoff enough to achieve a clean bay.
So what went wrong?
Lots of things went wrong. And I want to make clear that this becomes a lot clearer in hindsight. As somebody who's been doing this since like 1990 and going to lots of meetings, a lot of this was new stuff, and people didn't really understand things very well. And first of all, there was overestimation of how effective some of these best management practices could be, especially early on in reducing nutrients. And there was really never good communication. The Bay effort came from people who looked at the Bay, worked on estuary-type problems. They were really Bay-focused. And then when you got to the watershed and talking about agriculture, that was not something they historically had dealt with, and they didn't necessarily have a lot of interest in it. And so you had these two very distinct communities which kind of meshed like oil and water. And they didn't really talk. They didn't trust each other. The Bay people didn't trust the ag people. The ag people didn't trust the Bay people. They didn't engage very well. And that really set efforts back, and that there just was no trust of the system, no trust of each other, very bad communication. I think looking back on it, that just really hurt the whole process, because when you get to agriculture, what happens on a farm is based on a lot of many decisions that a farmer makes, like every single day, how they're going to carry out their operation. And there's a big behavioral component. If you're telling them to do something differently, particularly if it affects their bottom line, to go back to the best management practices, the way these were talked about early on is that these were common sense win-win type things. But in reality, a lot of these best management practices, even when there's government programs to help subsidize them, they don't pay the full cost. And it costs farmers to put money up, and it's things that often don't improve their bottom line. So there's not a big incentive for farmers to do a lot of these. And they have to have trust in the system. And because you had this very polarized agriculture, Bay type communities, there wasn't a lot of trust there. And I think that really hurt a lot of communication and probably adoption of some of these things.
In terms, by the way, of techniques, you point to things like the buffers along the rivers or even cover crops. Those would often be seen by farmers as problematic in terms of the amount that they could grow. Describe some of those details about what farmers are looking at these things, but they weren't necessarily beneficial to them.
In streamside buffers, you're taking land out of production. And so if you're a farmer, that's lost revenue. You're not growing things there. And cover crops are planted in the fall to absorb excess nutrients in the field and keep them there and keep them from running off. But that comes at a time around harvest and stuff. Farmers are doing a lot. It's just another thing on the plate that has to be done if it's going to be done and being right and be effective. Can be soil health benefits that come from planting cover crops, but there's logistical problems, and none of this is clearly win-win for a lot of farmers and a lot of perspectives.
So one of the things that strikes me is that this relationship between, say, the scientists on the one hand, or the agencies that are required to deal with trying to clean up the Bay, that they often come in conflict with, say, for instance, the Department of Agriculture, whose own mission is to promote agriculture. And it seems to me that you have this tremendous amount of lack of understanding on the part of the people who are trying to clean up the Bay to the kind of social and economic dynamics that, for instance, farmers have.
There's interesting conflicts between societal goals because everybody wants a healthy and productive agriculture system because we don't want to lose farms and things, and B, we need the food to eat. And so it's the policy of all the states to actually increase farm production and profitability, and that's the federal policy too. And so on one hand, we are promoting more production at the same time, and production tends to be nutrient intensive. So we're telling farmers on one hand through one set of policies to produce more, and then with the Bay policies, we're saying, oh, by the way, we want you to pollute less. And those get to be really tough things. To me, one of the most egregious examples of that is EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which is kind of in charge of some of the Bay efforts, and they're working to implement cleanup plans and telling states, to write these plans and implement them to reduce nutrients. And they're doing that on one hand, but the other hand, the EPA is promoting ethanol through its biofuel policies. And so there's a disconnect there because biofuels are predominantly made from corn. Corn's very nutrient intensive. It leaks a lot when you plant it. 2/5 of the nation's corn roughly goes to ethanol. We don't have ethanol plants here, but research clearly shows that EPA's policies boost corn costs, which promotes more production. And so we end up with more production in this region than would probably otherwise be the case. And so EPA is on one hand telling states, implement plans to reduce your farm runoff. And then on the other hand, it's telling farmers, oh, by the way, produce more of this really nitrogen leaky crop. And that doesn't make any sense.
One of the things you point to is this idea that we pour certainly millions, maybe billions of dollars into trying to restore the bay, all these projects in terms of investments into these measures that we mentioned a moment ago, best management practices. And I think in the piece you talk about the idea that the regulators like and the appropriators like projects, but not necessarily the staffing that requires a kind of oversight and a kind of training, for instance, relationship that this should have with the farmers.
Yeah, and this is kind of a big problem in general on a couple of different levels. First off, there's a fair amount of uncertainty as to the exact level of nutrients that run off farms, whether individual farms or farm fields in total across the watershed. That information is largely generated by computer models, but we historically have not invested enough money anyway to really have good understandings of nutrient processes on the landscape. And there's a fair amount of uncertainty over the effectiveness of the best management practices we put on the land. Are they as effective as we thought? There's delays from the time that something happens on the land and when it shows up in the water. And when you look at the computer modeling, it does not, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, does not show very great progress. And farmers say, well, we think we've done a lot. And it's hard to know how that plays out, what's real, because a lot of our data is just not that good. The monitoring tells you trends, but it doesn't tell you exactly why those trends are happening. So we kind of know what the nutrient trends are, but we don't necessarily know the drivers. And that, again, gets to the trust issue. It creates distrust in the system. But the emphasis for funding has really been on installing best management practices, because when you install best management practices, it creates these theoretical nutrient reductions for the bay. And so the more of them you put on the land, theoretically, the bay should be getting cleaner. But again, these aren't always in the farmer's best interest. They can work against their economics. They can reduce their production. They have to put out their own money often. It can be more time consuming. It can be more work. These often don't make a lot of sense for farmers economically or just in terms of their workload. And it takes time to convince people to do something. If you're telling someone to do more work and make less money and trying to make that sound like it makes sense, that takes a lot of working with farmers and saying maybe this will give you some benefits down the road. Maybe your productivity down the road would be better. You'll help your local streams and stuff. But that takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of technical assistance from like conservation districts, different state and federal agencies to go out and work with farmers. They'll often say that it requires something like maybe 5 visits on a farm from where you introduce the idea that maybe this would be a good thing to do on your farm to where they're willing to actually take the step and install that practice. And I've got reports on my shelf going back to like 1990 talking about the need for more technical assistance on farms. There's many reports over the years. This is just an often cited need. And we just really have not made that investment in personnel. Conservation districts, these often aren't great paying positions. Someone gets trained to do a job and then they take a private sector job. And so you got to bring somebody new on, and they have to start this relationship building with farmers all over. A lot of people would tell you this system really starts to break down on this farmer interaction because we just haven't made those investments. Again, the incentive has always been to get as much on the ground as possible without really kind of building the human infrastructure that it really takes to do that efficiently and effectively.
One of the things you point to is this idea that perhaps we've been concentrating on the wrong thing, that is the deep portion, for instance, of the Chesapeake Bay, as opposed to focusing on the tributaries, particularly to make progress and to build this relationship, say, with farmers.
Yeah, and this is something that, historically, if you go back to the 1980s when they started making nutrient reduction goals, the first goal was established in the 1987 Bay Agreement, which called for a 40% reduction in nitrogen and phosphorus. Goal then was to do it by 2000. They wanted the nutrient reductions to tie to something, and what it was tied to was getting rid of the dead zone, improving oxygen conditions in the upper part, in the deep waters of the upper bay, where those conditions tend to be worse. And that's been more or less one of the driving things for the nutrient reduction goals. And, talking about nutrient reductions in the deep part of the upper bay tends to be kind of an abstract goal to talk to people about on the land. And there's been more thinking in recent years, I think, and there was recently a big scientific report that came out which kind of suggested that looking at the deep trough, deep waters of the upper bay, keep that in the back of the mind, but maybe we should put our efforts into some of the shallow water areas around the bay and trying to improve conditions, because they would probably respond better and faster, and we could focus our efforts to get some results there. And similarly, people up in the watershed would tell you that, maybe we should target our efforts to where we can show these improvements in local streams. People can see improvements, they can buy into that type of a process, and they see a greater connection to what they're doing on the land and stream responses. And that's kind of getting some momentum, because it gets away from the system where right now you have a system where you put all these best management practices on the land, it gets fed into a computer model and theoretically produces these nutrient reductions, which theoretically will eventually improve the deep water of the bay, which is very distant. And the idea of tying what people are doing on the land to more localized responses and maybe putting more emphasis on that, there's a lot of people who make arguments that's a lot more persuasive if you're working with farmers to convince them to do something they're going to see in their local waters than telling them, if you do this, it's going to improve the way we model the Chesapeake Bay.
Finally, in terms of where we go from here, what the projection is out in terms of what you think is going to be happening to the bay in these cleanup efforts. I mean, do you have optimism about it, or is it measured? What sense do you get about it as you look forward in time?
I think that's really difficult because no one has crystal clear vision of how the future is going to be. I think that if we learn from what we do and we build on what we've learned and we make tweaks in our programs, we can continue to make, I think we've made nutrient reductions from agriculture, and I think we can continue to do that. There's going to be headwinds because the population's growing, the demand for more production is going to be there, and that is going to continue to threaten to offset progress. But I'm fairly optimistic that we can continue to get that trajectory going in the right direction. Whether we can reach our goals, which call for like about a 25% reduction from agriculture, That's a pretty big ask with the tools that we have today and our current knowledge. But we don't really know what we're going to be able to do at some point in the future, whether or not there's going to be some technological fixes. If we just keep doing the same thing, I can tell you I'm very pessimistic that we would make great strides. But if we learn and we do things differently, there's things on the horizon which can help. We can do this stuff more precisely. There may be some things we can do to treat manure to reduce the nutrient content. There's efforts underway to improve soil health, and those efforts may both produce production for farms and reduce some of the nutrient requirements and reduce some of the runoff. So there's potential that new things are on the horizon out there. And one thing I tell people a lot, when I started in 1990, I said early on, wastewater treatment plants have been produced like our largest nutrient reduction so far. I can show you reports on my office from 1990 that tell you that it's totally unfeasible to upgrade wastewater treatment plants because the technologies aren't going to be adopted. They're too expensive. It's just not realistic to achieve those nutrient reductions. Similarly, at that same time, people said it was totally unfeasible to reduce air emissions any significant amount. We would be doing good if we held the line on what was on nitrogen reaching the bay as a result of air pollution. Both of those have produced great results, which shows how badly we predict the future. So I always tell people that we can have a much better future. We can't totally predict how things are going to happen. Agriculture is a very dynamic thing, and trying to predict how that's going to play out, there's no crystal ball, I don't think, that can do that.
Karl Blankenship, editor-at-large for the Bay Journal, who is writing a series of pieces on the difficulty of curbing nutrient pollution from agriculture. You're listening to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush.
Delmarva Today with Don Rush.